The Vanderbilt name once meant something in America. It meant wealth beyond imagination, power that shaped industries, and mansions that rivaled European palaces. But behind the gilded gates and the society page photographs, the family carried secrets that would haunt generations, stories of tragedy, obsession, and decisions that destroyed lives. This is what really happened behind closed doors. Segment 5. The Commodore's Dark Foundation. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't start with money. He started with a ferry boat in Staten Island in 1810 when he was just 16 years old. His mother borrowed $100 to help him buy it, and he promised to pay her back with interest. That boat became 2 boats, then a fleet, then shipping lines, then railroads. By the time he died in 1877, he had accumulated a fortune of over $100 million, more than the entire United States Treasury held at the time. But the way he built that fortune left bodies in its wake, both literal and figurative. The Commodore, as he became known, was ruthless in business. He undercut competitors until they went bankrupt. He bribed politicians and judges. He manipulated stock prices and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. When rivals tried to compete with his steamship lines, he would slash prices below cost until they surrendered, then raise them higher than before. The shipping and railroad industries were brutal, and Vanderbilt was the most brutal of them all. His methods were legendary on Wall Street. He would buy up shares in competing companies, then orchestrate financial panics that tanked their stock prices, allowing him to acquire them cheaply. When the Erie Railroad tried to resist his takeover, he had the company's executives arrested. They fled to Jersey City, beyond New York jurisdiction, and conducted business from a hotel while Vanderbilt controlled the courts and the legislature back in Manhattan. The battle became a spectacle, with millions changing hands in bribes and legal fees. The Commodore's reputation for vengeance was well earned. One business partner who crossed him found every door in New York finance closed to him within a week. Vanderbilt used his influence to ensure the man could not borrow money, could not find investors, and eventually lost everything. The message was clear: cross Cornelius Vanderbilt and your career was finished. People feared him more than they respected him. His personal life was equally cold. He married his first cousin, Sophia Johnson, when he was 19. They had 13 children together. Sophia spent most of their marriage essentially running the household alone, while Cornelius built his empire. When she developed what doctors called consumption in the 1860s, Cornelius showed little interest in her condition. She died slowly, weakened and bedridden, while he continued his business pursuits. Their relationship had been one of convenience, not affection. After Sophia's death, the Commodore married a much younger woman named Frank Armstrong Crawford. She was 30 years his junior, barely older than some of his children. The marriage scandalized society, but Vanderbilt didn't care about society's opinion. He wanted a young wife and had the money to attract one. Frank provided companionship in his final years, but had little influence over his business decisions or his relationship with his children. The Commodore's treatment of his children was worse. He favored his youngest son, William Henry, but showed contempt for most of the others. His son, Cornelius Jeremiah, known as Cornel, struggled with gambling and epilepsy. Instead of helping him, the Commodore cut him off financially and publicly humiliated him. When Cornel was in his 30s, desperately in debt, he forged his father's signature to obtain money. The Commodore had him arrested and tried. The public trial destroyed what remained of Cornel's reputation. The trial was deliberately humiliating. The Commodore could have handled the matter privately, paying the debts and avoiding scandal. Instead, he chose to prosecute his own son in open court. Witnesses testified about Cornel's gambling debts, his desperation, his mental instability. Newspapers covered every detail. The message the Commodore sent was brutal. Even being his son provided no protection if you embarrassed him or stole from him. After the trial, Corneille's life spiraled further. He gambled compulsively, borrowed from anyone who would lend, and lived in shabby hotels. The Commodore refused all contact with him. When Corneille's epilepsy worsened, he had no family support and inadequate medical care. He existed on the margins of society, the son of the richest man in America living like a pauper. Other wealthy families whispered about it. How could Vanderbilt let his own son suffer so? But the Commodore was unmoved. In April 1882, 5 years after his father's death, Corneille checked into the Glenham Hotel in New York City. He was 49 years old, broke, sick, and alone. He took his own life in that hotel room with a pistol. The newspapers covered it as a scandal, the Vanderbilt son who ended so tragically. But the family's response was silence. They arranged a quiet burial and never spoke of him publicly again. To acknowledge Corneille would be to acknowledge the cruelty that had shaped his life. The other children fared little better in terms of their father's affection. His daughters were largely ignored. The Commodore viewed them as destined to marry and believed their husbands should support them. When his daughter married without his approval to a man he considered beneath the family, he barely acknowledged her thereafter. She received a small inheritance, but was effectively written out of the family narrative. The Commodore's will revealed the extent of his favoritism. Of his $100 million fortune, he left $95 million to William Henry, his youngest son. The rest of his children received relatively small bequests, some as little as $200,000, which was insulting given the size of the estate. His daughters received even less. The will sparked family feuds that lasted for years, with siblings suing each other and accusing William Henry of manipulating their father. The legal battles over the will were vicious. Some children claimed their father had been senile when he signed it, influenced by William Henry. Others argued that the distribution was so unequal it couldn't reflect the Commodore's true wishes. The lawsuits dragged through courts for years, consuming money in legal fees and exposing family dysfunction. Eventually, William Henry settled with some siblings to end the litigation, but the bitterness remained. But William Henry didn't need to manipulate anyone. The Commodore had always intended for him to inherit the bulk of the fortune. William had worked in the railroad business, proving himself capable and willing to follow his father's ruthless business methods. The other children were viewed as failures, or in the case of the daughters, simply as women who would marry and whose husbands would control any inheritance. The Commodore's view of family was transactional. You earned your place, or you were discarded. This foundation of ruthlessness and family destruction was what the Vanderbilt fortune was built upon. The money came from exploiting workers, crushing competitors, and bribing officials. The family dynamics were based on competition, favoritism, and the willingness to discard anyone who proved disappointing. And the pattern would repeat through the generations in different forms. The wealth continued, but so did the dysfunction. The next generation would face their own tragedies, but of a different kind. Segment 4. The Gilded Cage of Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in 1877, the same year the Commodore died. She was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Smith Vanderbilt. From birth, she was raised to be a prize, beautiful, cultured, and marriageable to European nobility. Her mother, Alva, was ambitious and controlling, determined to secure a title for her daughter that would cement the Vanderbilt's place in high society. Alva oversaw every aspect of Consuelo's upbringing: the girl's education, her clothing, her social interactions. All were carefully managed. Consuelo was taught French, music, art, and deportment. She learned to move gracefully, to speak quietly, to never express opinions that might offend. She wore painful steel rods strapped to her back to improve her posture. Her waist was cinched with tight corsets from a young age. She was being groomed not as a person, but as a commodity, a beautiful object to be displayed and eventually sold to the highest bidder. Alva's own marriage had been unhappy, and she channeled her frustrations into controlling her daughter. William Kissam Vanderbilt was unfaithful, and Alva knew it. Rather than addressing her own marriage, she focused obsessively on ensuring Consuelo would make a match that brought social prestige. It was as if securing a title for her daughter would somehow validate Alva's own life and choices. As Consuelo entered her teenage years, she fell in love with Winthrop Rutherford, an American from a respectable family. He was handsome, kind, and genuinely cared for her. They began a courtship that filled Consuelo with hope that she might marry for love. They took walks together, attended social functions, and exchanged letters. For the first time, Consuelo felt seen as a person rather than as a Vanderbilt asset. But Alva had other plans. An American husband, no matter how respectable, would not give her the social status she craved. She wanted a duke or an earl for her daughter. When Alva learned of Consuelo's feelings for Rutherford, she forbade their relationship. She removed Consuelo from social situations where they might meet. She monitored her daughter's correspondence, reading every letter. When Consuelo protested, Alva made herself ill, claiming the stress was endangering her health and threatening heart failure. She took to her bed, making Consuelo feel responsible for her mother's suffering. The manipulation was calculated and effective. The pressure intensified when Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, expressed interest in marrying Consuelo. The Duke needed money desperately. His ancestral estate, Blenheim Palace, was crumbling and required massive funds for maintenance. The roof leaked, the grounds were neglected, and debts were mounting. A marriage to a wealthy American heiress would solve his financial problems. Alva saw the perfect opportunity, a duke for her daughter, exactly as she had dreamed. Consuelo was 18 years old and wanted nothing to do with the duke. She found him cold and uninteresting. She was still in love with Rutherford, but Alva was relentless. She told Consuelo that if she refused the marriage, she would ruin Rutherford's reputation and destroy his career through her social connections. She threatened to disown Consuelo entirely, leaving her penniless. She wept and raged and manipulated, using every tactic available to wear her daughter down. The campaign lasted for months. Consuelo was isolated from anyone who might support her wishes. Friends who suggested she follow her heart were cut off from visiting. Even her father, who privately sympathized with her, did not intervene. He was dealing with his own marital problems with Alva and lacked the will to fight her on this issue. Consuelo was alone against her mother's determination. Finally, Consuelo broke. She agreed to marry the Duke. Years later, in her autobiography, she would describe being brought into a room where her mother and several family members were present. Her mother asked if she would marry the Duke. Consuelo, feeling trapped and exhausted, said yes. She later wrote that she felt as though she were consenting to her own execution. The analogy was not hyperbolic. She knew she was surrendering any chance at happiness. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church in New York City. It was called the Wedding of the Century. Thousands of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the bride. Police had to control the crowds. Inside the church, 6,000 guests filled every pew and space. Consuelo walked down the aisle in a dress that cost $30,000, wearing a family tiara. She was crying. Witnesses remembered seeing tears streaming down her face throughout the ceremony. Society pages reported it as the bride being overcome with emotion. The truth was that she was heartbroken. The marriage contract was essentially a business transaction. Vanderbilt money would flow to the Duke to maintain Blenheim Palace and support the aristocratic lifestyle. In exchange, Consuelo received a title and the Duke received a fortune. The legal documents specified exactly how much money would be provided and how it would be controlled. It was a merger, not a marriage. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning. The Duke took her to Blenheim Palace, the massive estate in Oxfordshire, England. The palace was cold, draughty, and filled with centuries of aristocratic tradition that had no room for an American girl's feelings. Built in the early 1700s, Blenheim had over 200 rooms, most of them uncomfortable and poorly heated. The estate employed hundreds of servants who followed rigid protocols that Consuelo didn't understand. Every meal, every social interaction, every moment of her day was governed by rules that seemed designed to remind her she was an outsider. The Duke's family treated her with barely concealed contempt. She was new money, American, and only valuable for the fortune she brought. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, was particularly cruel, constantly criticizing Consuelo's manners, her accent, and her understanding of English aristocratic customs. Servants reported hearing the Dowager make disparaging remarks about Americans and their lack of breeding. Consuelo was expected to smile and accept these insults without complaint. The Duke himself showed little interest in Consuelo beyond her money. Their relationship was formal and distant. They had separate bedrooms in different wings of the palace, separate routines, separate lives. The Duke spent his time managing the estate, attending the House of Lords, and pursuing his own interests. He maintained a mistress, which was socially acceptable for aristocratic men. Consuelo was expected to ignore this and focus on her duties as Duchess. She gave birth to 2 sons, John in 1897 and Ivor in 1898. The births were difficult, and Consuelo received minimal emotional support during her pregnancies and recoveries. Once the sons secured the succession, the Duke largely ignored her. She had fulfilled her primary function by producing heirs. The boys were raised primarily by nannies, according to aristocratic tradition, with limited maternal involvement permitted. Consuelo spent years isolated in the massive palace, maintaining appearances while dying inside. She was forbidden from seeing her own family frequently. The Duke controlled her correspondence and limited her travel to America. She attended social functions as required, smiled for photographs, and played the role of the Duchess. But privately, she was miserable. She wrote letters to friends describing her loneliness and despair. She developed health problems, severe headaches, exhaustion, and what doctors called nervous complaints that were likely depression. The palace itself felt like a prison. The enormous rooms were impossible to heat adequately. The formal gardens, while beautiful, offered little comfort. The endless corridors and vast spaces emphasized her isolation. She would walk through rooms filled with priceless art and antique furniture, surrounded by luxury but completely alone emotionally. Servants moved silently through the palace, trained not to acknowledge the Duchess's distress. After 11 years of marriage, Consuelo finally found the courage to leave. The separation was scandalous. Duchesses did not leave their husbands, especially not for reasons as mundane as unhappiness. But Consuelo did. She fought for her freedom and eventually obtained a legal separation in 1906. The Duke opposed it initially, but eventually agreed when it became clear Consuelo would not return. Years later, in 1921, the marriage was annulled by the Catholic Church on grounds that Consuelo had been forced into it against her will, allowing both to remarry. The annulment proceedings required Consuelo to testify about her mother's coercion. She had to describe in detail the threats, the manipulation, and the pressure that had forced her into the marriage. It was painful to relive, but it also validated what she had always known. She had been a victim, not a willing participant in the transaction that destroyed her youth. Consuelo's second marriage, to Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and military officer, was reportedly happy. She spent her later years doing philanthropic work, supporting various causes, and writing her memoirs. But the damage of those early years never fully healed. She had been sold by her mother, treated as property by her husband, and had lost the man she loved because of her family's ambition. The years at Blenheim had left psychological scars that time could not completely erase. In her autobiography, published when she was elderly, Consuelo wrote with remarkable honesty about her experiences. She described the loneliness, the fear, and the slow realization that her mother had destroyed her chance at happiness for the sake of social ambition. The book was a quiet act of revenge, revealing the truth that her family had tried to hide behind the glamorous story of the American Duchess. Her story was not unique among wealthy young women of the era, but it was particularly visible because of the Vanderbilt name, and Consuelo's forced marriage was just one example of how the family's wealth created its own kind of prison. The pressure to maintain status, to make advantageous marriages, to live up to the Vanderbilt name, it crushed people, but the family's troubles went even deeper than unhappy marriages. Segment 3. Gloria Vanderbilt and the custody battle. By the 1930s, the Vanderbilt fortune had been divided among many descendants. The mansion still stood, the name still carried weight, but the concentrated power of the Commodore's era was gone. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt represented this new generation. Wealthy, but not as wealthy as the public imagined, and caught in a scandal that would expose the family's dysfunction to the entire world. Gloria Morgan was a young socialite when she married Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt in 1923. She was 18, beautiful, and ambitious. Reginald was already showing signs of the alcoholism that would kill him. He was in his 40s, had been married before, and was known for his excessive lifestyle. The marriage seemed doomed from the start, but it produced a daughter, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, born in 1924. Reginald died in 1925, when little Gloria was only 15 months old. He left behind debts and a relatively modest trust fund for his daughter, approximately $5 million, substantial but not enormous by Vanderbilt standards. The trust was controlled by various family members and legal guardians appointed by the courts. Gloria Morgan, as the child's mother, was supposed to raise her daughter with the income from the trust, which provided about $48,000 per year. But Gloria Morgan had other priorities. She left little Gloria in the care of her nurse, Emma Keislich, and spent most of her time in Europe, socializing with various men and spending money freely on clothes, jewelry, and entertainment. The child grew up essentially motherless, cared for by servants while her mother pursued her own pleasures. When Gloria Morgan did visit, the interactions were brief and formal. The nurse provided more maternal care than the actual mother, feeding the child, comforting her when she was sick, and sleeping in the same room to be available if needed. Little Gloria's paternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, watched this situation with growing concern. Gertrude was wealthy in her own right, married to Harry Payne Whitney, and a sculptor of genuine talent. She had founded the Whitney Museum of American Art and was involved in cultural philanthropy. She genuinely cared about her niece and was horrified by Gloria Morgan's neglect. She began having little Gloria visit her Long Island estate for extended periods, providing the child with stability and attention. In 1932, Gertrude decided to seek custody of little Gloria. She filed a lawsuit arguing that Gloria Morgan was an unfit mother. What followed was one of the most sensational trials of the 1930s. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. Every day brought new revelations about the private lives of the wealthy. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators eager for scandal. The testimony was explosive. Servants described Gloria Morgan's affairs with various men, including European nobility and married men. One witness testified about seeing Gloria Morgan in bed with a famous royal figure. The nurse, Emma Keislich, testified about the child's neglect. and her mother's absence, describing how little Gloria would cry for her mother and receive no comfort, how she was left with servants while Gloria Morgan travelled, and how the child had developed fears and anxieties from the instability. There were allegations of inappropriate behaviour, of the child being exposed to situations no child should witness. Servants testified that little Gloria had walked in on her mother in compromising situations. There were stories of wild parties at the homes where the child was staying, with drinking and behaviour that shocked even 1930s sensibilities. The trial revealed a world of excess, neglect, and dysfunction behind the Vanderbilt name. The press coverage was relentless and often cruel. Newspapers published detailed accounts of the testimony, with headlines screaming about the scandalous behaviour of the wealthy. Gloria Morgan was portrayed as a heartless mother who cared more about parties and lovers than her own daughter. Gertrude Whitney was depicted as the noble aunt trying to save an innocent child. Little Gloria herself became a figure of public sympathy, the poor little rich girl caught between warring adults. Little Gloria herself, only 10 years old, was brought before the judge to express her preference. The decision to interview the child was controversial, as it placed enormous pressure on a young girl. In chambers, away from the press but with lawyers present, she reportedly told the judge she was afraid of her mother and wanted to live with her Aunt Gertrude. The testimony was devastating to Gloria Morgan, who had to hear that her own daughter preferred someone else. The judge ruled in favour of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Custody was granted to the aunt, with Gloria Morgan receiving limited visitation rights on weekends and holidays. The decision was a public humiliation for Gloria Morgan. She had lost her daughter and her reputation. The newspapers portrayed her as a neglectful, pleasure-seeking woman who cared more about parties than her child. Her social standing collapsed. Former friends avoided her, and she became a symbol of bad motherhood. But the damage to little Gloria was immense. She had been made into a public spectacle. Her family's dysfunction had been laid bare in newspapers across the country. Every detail of her young life, her fears, her preferences, her experiences, had been discussed in open court and printed for millions to read. She grew up knowing that she had been fought over in court, that testimony had been given about her mother's failures, and that she herself had been forced to choose between her mother and her aunt. The aftermath of the trial was difficult for everyone involved. Gloria Morgan never recovered her reputation, spending the rest of her life defending herself against the image created by the trial. Gertrude Whitney got custody, but also got a traumatized child who had been exposed to far too much adult conflict. And little Gloria grew up in the shadow of the trial, always aware that her childhood had been a public scandal. Gloria Vanderbilt later wrote about the custody battle and its effects on her life. She described feeling like property, something to be possessed rather than a person to be loved. The experience shaped her deeply. She struggled with relationships, married 4 times, seeking the stability and love she had never received as a child, and dealt with depression throughout her life. The wealth that should have provided security instead brought trauma. She eventually built her own career, becoming a fashion designer and artist. She created a jeans line that made her independently wealthy, proving she was more than just a Vanderbilt heiress. She appeared on talk shows and wrote memoirs where she discussed her difficult childhood with remarkable honesty. But in interviews, she often returned to her childhood, the loneliness, the feeling of being unwanted, the trial that exposed her family's secrets. The Vanderbilt name had given her fame, but it had also cursed her with a childhood of dysfunction and public humiliation. And the tragedies didn't end with Gloria's generation. Her own son, Carter Cooper, took his own life in 1988, jumping from the terrace of her 14th floor apartment while she watched helplessly, unable to stop him. The family curse seemed to continue, each generation marked by loss and trauma that money could never fix. But there were even darker stories buried in the family history. Segment 2. The Forgotten Vanderbilts. Not every Vanderbilt made it into the society pages or had their portraits painted. Some family members were quietly erased from the official narrative, their stories hidden because they didn't fit the image the family wanted to project. These forgotten Vanderbilts reveal perhaps the darkest aspect of the family, their willingness to discard anyone who threatened their reputation. Alice Claypool. Gwyn Vanderbilt, who married Cornelius Vanderbilt II, maintained an iron grip on the family's image. She was obsessed with propriety and status. When family members embarrassed the name through scandal or unconventional behaviour, she worked to minimise their presence in family records. Letters were destroyed, photographs were removed from albums, and certain relatives were simply not discussed. One particularly tragic case involved a distant Vanderbilt cousin who struggled with mental illness in the early 1900s. The family had the resources to provide excellent medical care, but mental illness carried enormous stigma. Instead of helping publicly, they institutionalized the relative in a private facility where they could be kept out of sight. The family paid for the care, but never visited. When the relative died after decades in the institution, the funeral was small and the death notice minimal. It was as though they had never existed. The family's treatment of relatives who married inappropriately was similarly harsh. When one Vanderbilt daughter eloped with a man her family deemed unsuitable, he was an artist without substantial money. She was cut off financially and socially. Her letters to family members went unanswered. When she tried to attend family gatherings, she was turned away. Eventually, she stopped trying. She lived a modest life with her husband, working to support themselves, while her relatives lived in mansions. She died without reconciling with her family. There were also the children born outside of marriage, the illegitimate offspring of Vanderbilt men who had affairs. These children were supported financially through quiet arrangements, but they could never claim the Vanderbilt name publicly. They grew up knowing who their father was, but unable to acknowledge it. Some received education and modest trust funds, enough to live comfortably, but never enough to be truly wealthy. They existed in a strange limbo, connected to one of America's richest families, but unable to access that connection. The Vanderbilt women who divorced faced particular cruelty. Divorce was scandalous in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the family often sided with reputation over the well-being of their female relatives. Women who left abusive marriages were sometimes blamed for the failure and ostracized. They lost access to family money, to social connections, and sometimes to their own children. The family protected the Vanderbilt name above all else, even when it meant abandoning women who needed help. The staff who worked for the Vanderbilts also witnessed the family's dark side. Servants signed agreements not to discuss what they saw or heard in Vanderbilt homes. Those who broke these agreements found themselves blacklisted, unable to find work in any respectable household. Some servants witnessed violence, affairs, and cruelty, but remained silent because speaking up would destroy their livelihoods. There are stories passed down among descendants of Vanderbilt servants about the things they saw. Violent arguments between spouses that left bruises covered by makeup and high collars. Children punished severely for minor infractions. Relatives who drank themselves into stupors night after night while the family maintained their public image of refinement. These stories were never meant to be public, but they survived through whispered conversations and private letters. The pressure to maintain appearances created an environment where genuine problems could never be addressed. Family members struggling with addiction, with mental health issues, with abusive relationships, they all suffered in silence because seeking help would mean admitting imperfection. The Vanderbilt name demanded perfection, and anyone who couldn't maintain that facade was discarded. This culture of secrecy and image management persisted for generations. Even as society became more open about personal struggles, the Vanderbilts remained intensely private. Family members who wanted to speak honestly about their experiences were pressured to remain quiet. The official family histories, the museum exhibitions, the biographies, they all focused on the mansions, the parties, and the business achievements. The human cost was left out, but maintaining that facade became harder as the fortune dissipated and the world changed. By the mid-20th century, the great Vanderbilt mansions were being demolished or turned into museums. The family's power had faded, and with that fading power came a slight loosening of control over the narrative. Segment 1: The Decline and the Reckoning. By the 1970s, there was no Vanderbilt on the list of the richest Americans. The fortune that had once been the largest in the nation had been divided, spent, and diminished. The mansions were mostly gone, demolished for development, or donated as museums. The breakers in Newport, Biltmore in North Carolina, and a few others survived as tourist attractions. But the family's wealth and power had evaporated. What happened to the Vanderbilt fortune has been studied by economists and financial historians. The simple answer is that it was spent faster than it could be replenished. The Commodore had been relentlessly focused on accumulation. His descendants were focused on spending. They built massive houses that required huge staffs to maintain. They threw elaborate parties. They collected art and jewels. They maintained lifestyles that consumed millions of dollars per year. The fortune was also divided among many heirs with each generation. The Commodore left most of his money to one son, but that son had multiple children, who had multiple children, and so on. By the third and fourth generations, there were dozens of Vanderbilts sharing what remained of the fortune. Individual inheritances, while still substantial, were not the massive concentrations of wealth the earlier generations had enjoyed. But the financial decline wasn't the only reckoning the family faced. As the decades passed and family members began speaking more openly, the carefully constructed image started to crack. Gloria Vanderbilt's memoirs revealed the dysfunction of her childhood. Other family members gave interviews acknowledging the pressure, the loneliness, and the cost of carrying the Vanderbilt name. Anderson Cooper, Gloria Vanderbilt's son and a prominent journalist, has spoken frankly about his family history. He has discussed his mother's traumatic childhood, his brother's death, and the isolation that came with being a Vanderbilt. He has acknowledged that the wealth brought as many problems as it solved. His candor represents a break from the generations of secrecy that preceded him. The modern Vanderbilts are a mix of people, some wealthy, some not, some famous, some living quiet lives far from the spotlight. They carry the name, but not the concentrated power their ancestors wielded. For many of them, the family history is a burden rather than a source of pride. They know the stories of tragedy, of lives destroyed by the pressure to maintain appearances, of the cruelty that was justified in the name of preserving the family reputation. The mansions that survive as museums offer a sanitized version of Vanderbilt history. Tourists walk through the elaborate rooms and marvel at the opulence. Tour guides discuss the architecture, the art collections, and the social history. But they rarely mention Corneille dying alone in a hotel room, or Consuelo crying through her wedding, or the forgotten relatives institutionalized and erased. The full story is too dark for the brochures. What the Vanderbilt family history teaches is that wealth alone cannot protect against human suffering. The money bought mansions and jewels and social status, but it couldn't buy happiness or healthy relationships or freedom from trauma. In many ways, the wealth made things worse. It created pressure to maintain appearances. It provided the resources to hide problems rather than solve them. And it turned family members into assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. The Commodore would likely be disappointed in how his fortune disappeared. He built an empire through ruthlessness and determination, believing he was creating a dynasty that would last forever. Instead, his descendants spent themselves into relative obscurity within a few generations. But perhaps the money was always cursed by the way it was made, built on exploitation, maintained through cruelty, and passed down with conditions and expectations that crushed the people who inherited it. The Vanderbilt story is fundamentally American. The rise from nothing to unimaginable wealth, the excess, the eventual decline. But it's also a story about the cost of that wealth. Every fortune has a human price, and the Vanderbilts paid it repeatedly across generations. The secrets they tried to hide, the tragedies, the cruelty, the dysfunction. These were the real inheritance that passed from parent to child. The Vanderbilt name still resonates in American culture, but now it's more often associated with history than with power. The family that once controlled railroads and dominated society is now mostly a collection of individuals connected by lineage and by the weight of a complicated past. The disturbing secrets behind the family, the destroyed lives, the forced marriages, the children raised without love, the relatives erased from history. These are finally being acknowledged as part of the story. Understanding the full truth of the Vanderbilt family doesn't diminish the legitimate achievements. The Commodore was undeniably brilliant in business. The mansions were architectural marvels. The family's patronage supported important cultural institutions. But those achievements existed alongside genuine cruelty and suffering. Both things are true, and both deserve to be remembered. The descendants living today carry that dual legacy. They have access to a name that opens doors and brings recognition, but they also carry the burden of a history filled with tragedy. Many of them have chosen to build their own lives separate from the Vanderbilt identity, finding success in their own right while acknowledging the complicated family they came from. The mansions remain as monuments to a different era. Visitors can walk through the breakers or Biltmore and imagine what it was like to live with such wealth. But they should also imagine Consuelo crying in her room, or little Gloria being fought over in court, or Cornel dying alone and forgotten. The whole story, the beautiful and the terrible, is what makes the Vanderbilt history worth examining. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. In 1920, one man controlled wealth equivalent to $200 billion in today's money. He'd built the largest private fortune in American history through a single product that transformed the entire world. His company didn't just make cars, it defined American manufacturing, created the middle class, and changed how every person on Earth lived. 90 years later, his descendants struggle to maintain control of a company hemorrhaging billions. Their personal fortunes a fraction of what their ancestor commanded. The Ford name still graces millions of vehicles, but the empire that name built is fading faster than anyone outside the family realizes. This is the story of how America's most iconic automotive dynasty rose to unimaginable heights, then slowly, inexorably lost everything that made it dominant. The farm boy who built an empire. Henry Ford was born in 1863 on a farm in Springwells Township, Michigan, the eldest of 6 children. His father expected him to take over the family farm, to live the predictable life of a rural farmer like generations before him. Henry had other ideas. When his mother died in 1876, something inside him shifted. He was 13 years old, and he decided that farm life wasn't his destiny. He left home at 16 for Detroit, finding work as a machinist's apprentice. The work was dangerous, dirty, and paid almost nothing, but Henry loved it. He was fascinated by machines, by how things worked, by the emerging world of mechanical power. He spent his days learning to fix engines and his nights dreaming about building something bigger. In 1888, Henry married Clara Jane Bryant. They would have one son together, Edsel, born in 1893. Henry worked various jobs, eventually landing a position at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. He rose quickly to chief engineer, a good job with decent pay and security. Most men would have been satisfied. Henry wasn't. In his spare time, he was building something in a shed behind his house, a gasoline-powered vehicle he called the quadricycle. He completed it in 1896, and it actually worked. The machine was crude, unreliable, and impractical, but it proved the concept was possible. Henry became convinced that automobiles were the future, that he could build them better and cheaper than anyone else. His first venture into automobile manufacturing, the Detroit Automobile Company, failed in 1901. Investors pulled out, and the company collapsed. Most people would have given up. Henry tried again, forming a new company that also failed. By 1903, at age 40, Henry Ford had failed twice in the automobile business. He had no money, limited prospects, and a wife and son to support. But in June 1903, 12 investors pulled $28,000 to give Henry one more chance. They founded the Ford Motor Company, with Henry owning 255 of the 1,000 shares, a minority stake. The investors made it clear, produce a car that sells, or this company dies too. Henry produced cars, but he wasn't satisfied with them. For the first 5 years, Ford Motor Company produced 8 different models, experimenting with designs and features. The stockholders were happy, the company was profitable, and sales were growing. But Henry had a vision they didn't share. He wanted to build one car, mass-produced, affordable for ordinary Americans. The Model T. In 1908, Henry announced that Ford would only make the Model T going forward. No more experimentation, no luxury features, just one simple, rugged, reliable car that anyone could afford to buy and fix. The stockholders, including the Dodge brothers who supplied chassis to Ford, were furious. They wanted variety, wanted to chase wealthy customers with expensive models. They took Henry to court in 1916 to stop him from reinvesting profits into expansion rather than paying bigger dividends. Henry won the lawsuit, but learned a lesson. As long as other people owned part of his company, they could interfere with his vision. In 1918, he resigned as president, turning the position over to his son Edsel. Then Henry announced he was forming a new company to build cars even cheaper than the Model T. It was a bluff, but it worked. The minority stockholders panicked, worried they'd be left holding worthless shares in a company Henry was abandoning. By July 1919, Henry had bought out all 7 minority stockholders for $106 million. The Ford Motor Company became a 100% family-owned enterprise. Never before had one man controlled so completely such a massive industrial corporation. And the company was growing explosively. The Model T sold for $850 in 1908. By 1924, through constant efficiency improvements, Ford had reduced the price to $290. At that price, ordinary working families, including Ford's own workers, could afford to buy cars. The automobile transformed from a luxury item for the rich into a necessity for the middle class. Henry revolutionized manufacturing with the moving assembly line. Before Ford, skilled craftsmen built cars by hand, one at a time. Ford broke production into simple, repetitive tasks performed by workers who needed minimal training. A completed car rolled off the line every 24 seconds. The efficiency was unprecedented, the productivity staggering. In 1914, Henry made another revolutionary decision. He would pay workers $5 per day, more than double the typical manufacturing wage. Other industrialists called him crazy, said he was ruining the labour market. Henry understood something they didn't. Well-paid workers could afford to buy the products they made. creating a consumer economy that would drive growth for decades. He wasn't being generous. He was creating his own customer base. By the 1920s, Ford Motor Company dominated the automotive industry. The Model T represented over 50% of all cars sold in America. The company's profits were enormous, and Henry's personal wealth reached approximately $1.2 billion, equivalent to over $200 billion today. He was one of the richest humans who had ever lived, and he'd done it all by making a product so good and so cheap that everyone wanted one. But success at this scale created its own problems. Henry had built his empire through absolute control, through trusting his own instincts over everyone else's advice. That approach had made him rich. It would also begin his company's long, slow decline. The son who died too soon. Edsel Ford was born into his father's shadow in 1893, and he would never escape it. From childhood, everyone knew Edsel would inherit the company. His father groomed him for leadership, but on Henry Ford's terms, which meant very little actual authority. Edsel was nothing like his father. Where Henry was stubborn and crude, Edsel was refined and diplomatic. Where Henry trusted his gut, Edsel listened to advisors. Where Henry saw cars as purely functional tools, Edsel appreciated design and aesthetics. These differences would define their troubled relationship for the next 4 decades. In 1918, Henry made Edsel president of Ford Motor Company. Edsel was 25 years old, finally in charge of the family business. Except he wasn't actually in charge. Henry retained final authority on all major decisions. When Edsel made choices Henry disagreed with, Henry simply overruled him. Publicly, Edsel was president. Privately, everyone knew Henry still ran everything. The 1920s should have been Ford's decade of continued dominance. The Model T was still selling well, and the company's profits remained strong. But competitors were evolving. General Motors, led by Alfred Sloan, introduced yearly model changes, more comfortable cars, stylish designs, and modern features like hydraulic brakes and synchronized transmissions. Chevrolet began stealing market share from Ford. Edsel saw what was happening and begged his father to modernize. The Model T was outdated. Customers wanted more than basic transportation. They wanted enclosed cabins instead of open-air driving. They wanted gear shifts instead of Ford's planetary transmission. They wanted colours other than black. Henry refused to change. He'd made a fortune on the Model T formula. Simple, cheap, mass-produced. Why fix what wasn't broken? By 1926, the Model T was deeply broken. Sales collapsed as customers abandoned Ford for more modern competitors. The company finally stopped Model T production in 1927 after building 15 million units over 19 years. It was the end of an era. Edsel pushed for something different, a car that combined affordability with style and modern features. The Model A, introduced in 1927, was that car. It was successful, selling millions of units and helping Ford regain market share. But the victory was bittersweet for Edsel. He'd won the battle to replace the Model T, but he'd had to fight his own father every step of the way. In 1922, Henry bought the Lincoln Motor Company, a luxury car maker that had fallen into bankruptcy. He gave Lincoln to Edsel to manage, and it became Edsel's real contribution to Ford. Under Edsel's leadership, Lincoln produced beautiful, well-designed luxury cars. Edsel had an eye for aesthetics that his father lacked. The Continental, which Edsel personally designed, became one of the most beautiful American cars ever made. But Edsel's influence remained limited to Lincoln. When it came to Ford's main business, Henry still dominated, and Henry was becoming increasingly erratic. He hired a brutal enforcer named Harry Bennett to run company security at the massive River Rouge plant. Bennett used intimidation and violence to prevent union organizing, creating an atmosphere of fear. Edsel hated Bennett's methods, but couldn't stop them. Henry protected Bennett completely. The worst indignity came in 1941, when Ford workers finally voted to unionize despite Bennett's intimidation. The union demanded negotiations. Henry wanted to shut the plant down rather than recognize the union, even if it meant destroying the company. Edsel, Clara Ford, Henry's wife, and other family members had to force Henry to accept the union contract. It was a humiliating defeat for Henry, and he blamed Edsel for not supporting him. Edsel's health had never been robust, and years of stress from fighting his father took their toll. He developed stomach ulcers and other ailments. In 1942, his health began seriously declining. Doctors eventually diagnosed stomach cancer. Edsel Ford died on May 26, 1943, at age 49. He left behind a wife, Eleanor, and 4 children: Henry II, Benson, Josephine, and William. Henry Ford, nearly 80 years old and showing signs of dementia, reassumed the presidency after Edsel's death. The company's board of directors, dominated by Henry's loyalists, elected him despite reservations. It was a disaster. Henry's mental capacity was deteriorating. He couldn't manage the enormous complexity of running Ford during wartime production. The company began losing over $10 million per month, more than $180 million today. The federal government seriously considered taking over Ford Motor Company to ensure wartime production continued. Clara Ford and Eleanor Ford, Edsel's widow, finally intervened. In 1945, they threatened to sell all their stock if Henry didn't step down. Henry relented. He turned control over to his grandson, Henry Ford II, who was just 28 years old and had been discharged from the Navy to save the family business. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, at age 83 from a cerebral hemorrhage. He left most of his vast wealth to the Ford Foundation, a charitable organisation Edsel had established in 1936 with a $25,000 donation. The foundation would become one of the richest philanthropic institutions in the world. But Henry also arranged for something crucial. The family would maintain permanent control of Ford Motor Company through a special class of voting stock. This dual-class stock structure would allow the Ford family to control the company even as their ownership percentage declined. Class B shares, held entirely by family members, carried voting rights that let them elect 40% of the board of directors. The vast majority of the company's equity would be in non-voting Class A shares, first held by the foundation and later by public shareholders. It was a brilliant arrangement that would let the family maintain power with minimal financial stake. It would also prove to be both their salvation and their curse. The grandson who saved the company, Henry Ford II, inherited a disaster in 1945. The company his grandfather had built was hemorrhaging money, had outdated management practices, kept primitive accounting systems that made it impossible to know which products were profitable, and employed thousands of workers who distrusted management after years of Harry Bennett's reign of terror. Henry II, known as Hank the Deuce, had virtually no business training. He'd attended Yale but was expelled for cheating. The Navy had discharged him specifically to save Ford Motor Company from collapse. His first move was brutal but necessary. He fired Harry Bennett and his entire corrupt security apparatus. Bennett had controlled access to Henry Ford, had used intimidation and violence to maintain power, and had created a shadow organization within the company loyal only to him. His departure was met with celebration by workers who'd lived in fear for years. But firing Bennett was the easy part. Henry II needed to actually learn how to run an enormous corporation, and he needed to do it fast. He made a series of brilliant hires. He brought in Ernest Breech and Louis Crusoe from General Motors. experienced executives who understood modern corporate management. He hired a group of 10 young Air Force officers who developed statistical management techniques during the war. These whiz kids, led by Robert McNamara, brought analytical rigor to Ford's chaotic operations. Over the next decade, Henry II transformed Ford Motor Company. He modernized accounting systems, implemented professional management practices, developed new models that could compete with GM and Chrysler, and expanded Ford's international operations. In 1956, he took the company public, selling shares to outside investors for the first time since 1919. The stock offering raised massive capital for expansion, while the dual-class share structure kept the family in control. Under Henry II's leadership, Ford thrived through the 1950s and 1960s. The company introduced successful models like the Thunderbird and the Mustang. It competed effectively against GM and Chrysler, maintaining its position as America's second-largest automaker. Henry II became a business celebrity, appearing on magazine covers, hobnobbing with politicians and entertainers, living a life of wealth and privilege that seemed to justify itself through business success. But Henry II had inherited more than his grandfather's company. He'd inherited his grandfather's flaws. He was autocratic, quick to anger, and intolerant of disagreement. He surrounded himself with executives who told him what he wanted to hear. When Lee Iacocca, one of Ford's most successful executives and the father of the Mustang, became too popular and too powerful, Henry II fired him in 1978. Iacocca went to Chrysler and led that company's resurrection, while Ford lost one of its most talented leaders. Henry II's personal life was chaotic. He divorced his first wife to marry Christina Vittoria Austin, an Italian divorcee, in a Catholic ceremony that scandalized the deeply Protestant Ford family. That marriage also ended in divorce. His drinking became legendary, not social drinking, but serious alcoholism that affected his judgment and health. By the 1970s, Henry II was more interested in his social life than in managing Ford's business. In 1979, Henry II resigned as CEO, and in 1980 he stepped down as chairman. For the first time since 1945, the Ford family didn't directly manage Ford Motor Company. Professional managers ran the business while the family maintained control through their voting shares. Henry II died in 1987, and his death marked the end of an era. The family still controlled Ford, but they no longer led it. Except the company they controlled was heading toward disaster. The long slide toward irrelevance. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Ford Motor Company struggled to maintain relevance in an industry that was transforming around it. The dominance Henry Ford had established in the 1920s seemed like ancient history. Japanese manufacturers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, didn't just compete with American cars, they redefined what consumers expected. Their vehicles were more reliable, more fuel efficient, better engineered. Quality control that American manufacturers treated as aspirational, Japanese companies considered baseline. The culture shock hit American automakers hard. Ford had spent decades assuming customers would buy whatever Detroit produced because there were no alternatives. The Japanese proved there were always alternatives. American consumers, raised on domestic brands through fierce loyalty and patriotism, started buying Hondas and Toyotas because they simply worked better. They didn't break down as often. They didn't need constant repairs. They held their value longer. Ford tried to respond. The company invested in quality improvement programs, studied Japanese manufacturing techniques, attempted to modernize its approach. Sometimes it worked. The Ford Taurus, introduced in 1986, was genuinely innovative and sold well. But for every success, there were missteps and failures that undermined progress. The Ford Pinto scandal epitomized everything wrong with 1970s Ford. The company introduced the subcompact car in 1971 to compete with rising imports. During development, engineers discovered a dangerous design flaw. The fuel tank was positioned too close to the rear bumper, and even minor rear-end collisions could rupture the tank, causing fires. Ford calculated that fixing the problem would cost $11 per vehicle. They then calculated the cost of potential lawsuits from deaths and injuries. The infamous internal memo concluded that paying settlements for deaths would be cheaper than fixing every car. Ford left the defect unfixed. When this calculation became public knowledge during litigation, the backlash was devastating. Ford wasn't just making bad cars. They were knowingly selling dangerous cars because fixing them wasn't cost-effective. The scandal cemented a perception that Detroit prioritized profits over safety, that American manufacturers couldn't be trusted. It damaged Ford's reputation for decades and provided ammunition to consumer advocates and regulators pushing for stricter safety standards. The company went through cycles of restructuring and recovery. Sometimes new models would sell well and profits would improve. The Explorer SUV, introduced in 1990, became Ford's best-selling vehicle and helped the company capitalize on America's shift from cars to trucks and SUVs. Then quality problems or design missteps would undermine progress. The Ford market share eroded steadily from its 1920s peak of over 50% to less than 20% by the 1990s. Labor relations remained contentious. Ford workers, represented by the United Auto Workers Union, fought for better wages and benefits, while the company struggled to compete with Japanese manufacturers whose labor costs were lower. The compromises they reached, generous wages and pensions for workers, flexibility for management to cut costs elsewhere, would come back to haunt the company during the 2008 crisis. By 2001, Ford was in crisis again. The company lost $5.5 billion that year, an astronomical sum that shocked analysts. The Explorer SUV, Ford's bestseller and profit driver, became embroiled in a deadly scandal involving Firestone tire failures that caused vehicles to roll over. Over 200 deaths were linked to the defects. The recall and litigation cost billions. Sales of Explorers cratered as customers fled to competing SUVs. The crisis was particularly painful because Firestone had been Ford's partner since the Model T era. Harvey Firestone and Henry Ford had been personal friends. Henry's grandson, William Clay Ford Sr., had married Martha Firestone, Harvey's granddaughter, cementing the relationship between the families. The Explorer Firestone scandal destroyed that century-old partnership and forced both companies to publicly blame each other for the deaths. William Clay Ford Jr., Henry Ford's great-grandson, was serving as chairman but had never run the company's operations. The board was discussing bringing in an outside CEO when Bill Ford made a bold decision. He would take over as CEO himself. In October 2001, he became the first Ford family member to run the company since Henry Ford II retired in 1979. Bill Ford cared deeply about the company and about environmental sustainability. He spoke passionately about building vehicles that weren't just profitable, but responsible. He pushed Ford to invest in hybrid technology and fuel efficiency. He understood that the automotive industry needed to change, that climate concerns and oil prices meant the era of gas-guzzling SUVs couldn't last forever. He was thoughtful, conscientious, genuinely committed to leaving Ford better than he'd found it. But caring wasn't enough. The automotive industry was brutally competitive and unforgiving of mistakes. Bill Ford lacked the ruthless decisiveness the crisis demanded. He couldn't bring himself to make the massive cuts necessary to return Ford to profitability. He couldn't fire long-time employees who weren't performing. He struggled to make hard choices that would hurt people he knew personally. His decency, which made him admirable as a person, made him ineffective as a CEO during crisis. Ford continued losing billions annually. In 2005, Ford lost $1.6 billion. In 2006, the loss reached $12.7 billion, one of the largest annual losses in corporate history. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Plants operated far below capacity. Healthcare and pension obligations to retirees were crushing the company financially. Market share kept declining as Honda and Toyota took customers Ford couldn't keep. The board grew increasingly concerned. Some directors wanted to replace Bill Ford immediately. Others wanted to give the family one more chance. Finally, in September 2006, Bill Ford made the hardest decision of his life. He stepped down as CEO and hired Alan Mulally away from Boeing to save the company. It was an admission that loving the company wasn't enough, that the Ford family could no longer successfully manage their own business. The decision showed remarkable self-awareness and courage. Bill Ford could have clung to power, could have insisted the family deserved one more chance. Instead, he acknowledged reality. Ford Motor Company needed professional management, needed someone who could make brutal decisions without emotional attachment to the Ford family legacy. By stepping aside, Bill Ford possibly saved the company, even as he conceded that the Ford dynasty's operational control was over. Mulally proved to be exactly what Ford needed. He was an outsider with no emotional connection to Ford traditions or family dynamics. He could make decisions based purely on business logic. Almost immediately upon taking over, Mulally mortgaged everything. The factories, the equipment, the patents, even the Ford Blue oval logo, everything became collateral. He raised $23.6 billion in capital by essentially betting the entire company. Many observers thought Mulally was crazy. Borrowing that much money in 2006 seemed reckless. Then the 2008 financial crisis struck, the economy collapsed, and Mulally looked like a genius. GM and Chrysler went bankrupt and needed government bailouts to survive. Ford, fortified by Mulally's aggressive borrowing, survived without federal assistance. It was the only American automaker that didn't need to be rescued by taxpayers. But survival came at enormous cost. Ford spent the next decade paying off the massive debt Mulally had incurred. Interest payments consumed profits that could have funded new vehicle development or expansion into new markets. While Toyota and Volkswagen expanded globally while Chinese manufacturers built EV capabilities, Ford was struggling to pay down debt and right-size its operations for a permanently smaller market share. The company had to sell luxury brands it had acquired during better times. Jaguar, Land Rover, Aston Martin, Volvo, all sold off to raise capital and focus on the Ford and Lincoln brands. Each sale represented an admission that Ford's dreams of becoming a global luxury powerhouse had failed. The company retreated to its core business, trucks and SUVs for the American market. By 2010, Ford had returned to profitability, and Mulally was hailed as one of the great corporate turnaround artists. But the company he'd saved was a shadow of what it had been. Ford's global market share continued declining. The company had essentially abandoned most foreign markets to focus on North America. In China, the world's largest automotive market, Ford was irrelevant compared to GM, Volkswagen, and local manufacturers. Bill Ford remained executive chairman, keeping the family's symbolic presence. He attended board meetings, consulted with Mulally, represented the family's interests. But real power resided with professional managers. The arrangement worked in terms of business performance. Mulally and his successor, Jim Farley, navigated Ford through the transition from traditional cars to SUVs and trucks, then toward electric vehicles. But the family's control, once absolute, had become largely ceremonial. they could elect 40% of the board through their Class B shares, enough to block major changes, but not enough to dictate strategy. Professional managers consulted with Bill Ford, respected the Ford family history, thanked him for his input, then ultimately made their own decisions based on market realities rather than family tradition. And the family's wealth, once incomprehensible in its magnitude, had fragmented across generations and shrunk in relative terms until individual family members, while comfortable, were no longer among America's super rich. The Fords had become merely wealthy in a nation where new tech billionaires made Henry Ford's fortune look modest. The wealth that vanished. Henry Ford's decision to leave most of his fortune to the Ford Foundation rather than to his descendants had long-term consequences the family is still living with today. The decision was partly about taxes. The federal estate tax in the 1940s was punitive on large fortunes, reaching rates over 70%. By putting the money in a charitable foundation, Henry avoided having his estate decimated by taxes. But it also reflected his complicated relationship with wealth and family. Henry had never been particularly interested in luxury or spending. He lived modestly compared to other billionaires of his era. He wore plain clothes, ate simple food, avoided ostentation. What he cared about was control over his company, over his products, over his legacy. The foundation structure let him keep the Ford family in control of Ford Motor Company, while putting the actual wealth beyond the reach of heirs who might squander it. The foundation received non-voting Class A shares that represented most of the company's equity. By some estimates, the foundation owned over 90% of Ford Motor Company's value when Henry died. The family got the voting Class B shares, which controlled the company through their 40% board election power, but represented a much smaller percentage of the company's total value. It was a brilliant estate planning strategy that preserved family control while funding charitable works. But it meant that as Ford Motor Company grew in value through the 1950s and 1960s, most of that wealth accrued to a foundation the family couldn't access. They controlled the company but didn't own it. When Ford went public in 1956 through Henry Ford II's initiative, this arrangement became even more apparent. The initial public offering raised enormous capital for the company by selling shares to outside investors. But those shares were non-voting Class A shares. The Ford family retained all the voting Class B shares, maintaining control while their ownership percentage shrank. Over subsequent decades, the Ford Foundation diversified its holdings, recognizing that having most of its endowment tied up in a single company's stock was financially risky. The foundation sold Ford shares gradually and invested in a diverse portfolio of stocks, bonds, and other assets. This was sound financial management for the foundation, but it meant the foundation's interests increasingly diverged from the company's and the family's. The foundation became one of the world's wealthiest philanthropic institutions, with an endowment that peaked at over $16 billion. It funded civil rights initiatives, supported the arts, invested in education, promoted social justice causes. The work was admirable and important, but that wealth didn't belong to the Ford family. It belonged to a charity they couldn't control, and after Henry Ford II's 1976 resignation from the foundation's board, didn't even influence. The family's personal wealth came primarily from their Class B shares and whatever other investments they'd made. Those Class B shares gave them tremendous power. They controlled Ford Motor Company with a minority ownership stake. But power isn't the same as wealth, especially when the company you control keeps losing money. By 2010, the Ford family's Class B shares represented less than 2% of Ford Motor Company's total equity. The company had over 1 billion shares outstanding, and the family held about 70 million Class B shares. When Ford stock traded at $10 per share, those shares were worth $700 million. substantial but not dynastic wealth when divided among dozens of family members. William Clay Ford Sr., Henry Ford's youngest grandson and the last surviving grandchild, managed to accumulate a personal fortune estimated at $1.4 billion when he died in 2014. He'd invested wisely over decades, had received substantial dividends when Ford was profitable, and owned the Detroit Lions football team, which had appreciated enormously in value. But even his $1.4 billion fortune was a tiny fraction of the $200 billion in equivalent wealth his grandfather had commanded. And William Clay Sr.'s fortune had to be divided. His widow Martha Firestone Ford received a large share. Their 4 children, William Clay Jr., Sheila, Martha, and Elizabeth, received portions as well. Estate taxes took their share. By the time the division was complete, no individual heir had more than a few $100 million from the immediate inheritance, though they retained their Ford stock holdings and other investments. Today, individual Ford family members have net worths that vary dramatically based on their stock holdings, career success, and investment acumen. Bill Ford Jr., as executive chairman of Ford Motor Company and the company's largest individual shareholder with over 15 million shares, has a net worth estimated between $200 million and $1 billion depending on Ford's stock price and his other holdings. His sister, Sheila Ford Hamp, who owns the Detroit Lions, has similar wealth, possibly more given the team's value has soared to over $3 billion. By the standards of ordinary Americans, they're fantastically wealthy. By the standards of America's richest families, the Waltons, the Koch family, the Mars family, they're not even close. The Walton family, heirs to Walmart, has a combined net worth exceeding $250 billion. The Koch family is worth over $100 billion. The Mars family, who control the candy company, is worth over $90 billion. The Ford family, descendants of a man richer than any of those families' founders, is worth perhaps $5 billion combined across all living relatives. It's still wealth beyond most people's imagination, but it's a catastrophic decline from what they once had. Part of the decline comes from the structure Henry Ford created, giving most of the company to a foundation. Part comes from Ford Motor Company's diminished position in the global automotive industry. In 1920, Ford was the world's largest automaker and one of the most profitable companies on earth. In 2024, Ford ranks 7th globally by sales, behind Toyota, Volkswagen, Hyundai, Kia, GM, Stellantis, and Honda. The company Ford family members control is no longer dominant, but part of the decline is simply mathematical. Henry Ford had one child, Edsel. Edsel had 4 children. Those 4 had multiple children, who've had their own children. There are now dozens of Ford descendants, and the family fortune divides further with each generation. Some family members work at Ford or the Detroit Lions. Others have no involvement with the family businesses. Some remain close to Bill Ford and the company. Others have effectively left the Ford dynasty behind. In 1976, Henry Ford II dramatically resigned from the Ford Foundation's board of directors, severing the connection between the family and the foundation his father had established. He disagreed with the foundation's progressive politics and philanthropic choices. The split lasted 40 years, a public symbol of how far the family had drifted from the institutions bearing their name. Only in 2019, after Detroit's 2013 bankruptcy forced the foundation and the family to work together to save their hometown, did the family and foundation reconcile. Henry Ford III, Bill Ford's son, joined the foundation's board, the first Ford to serve since his great-grandfather's resignation. It was a healing gesture, but it came after decades of estrangement, the future of a fading dynasty. Bill Ford, stands as possibly the last family member who will lead Ford Motor Company. He's in his late 60s, and none of his 4 children have shown interest in taking over. Henry Ford III works in business, but not at Ford Motor Company. The next generation seems more interested in living comfortable lives funded by family wealth than in spending decades rebuilding an automotive empire. The company itself faces existential challenges. The transition to electric vehicles threatens to upend the entire automotive industry. Tesla, a company that didn't exist until 2003, is now worth more than all traditional automakers combined. Chinese EV manufacturers are becoming global players. Ford is investing billions in electric vehicle development, but it's playing catch-up to competitors who moved faster. Ford lost $4.7 billion on electric vehicles in 2023 alone. The company's EV strategy is necessary. The world is shifting to electric, but it's hemorrhaging money in the transition. The company's stock price has stagnated for years. Shareholders grow restless. Analysts question whether Ford can compete in the EV era. And through it all, the Ford family maintains their 40% voting control through Class B shares that represent less than 2% of the company's equity. It's a structure that made sense when the family still actively managed the business. Now it looks increasingly anachronistic. A family clinging to control of a company they can no longer successfully lead. If the family's Class B holdings fall below 60.7 million shares, their voting power drops from 40% to 30%. If holdings fall below 33.7 million shares, they lose majority control entirely. The shares get divided among more family members with each generation. At some point, perhaps in Bill Ford's lifetime, perhaps in his children's, the Ford family will finally lose control of Ford Motor Company. When that happens, the family will still be wealthy. They'll still own valuable stock. They'll still have the Ford name, but they'll be minority shareholders in a company someone else runs, no different from thousands of other investors. The dynasty will have ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet fade into irrelevance. The Ford family story is American capitalism in microcosm. One brilliant, driven man builds something transformative through innovation and ruthlessness. His descendants inherit wealth and power, but not his genius. They struggle to maintain what he built as the world changes around them, eventually diluted across generations and unable to adapt to new realities. The dynasty fragments. Henry Ford transformed the world by making cars affordable for ordinary people. He created the modern middle class by paying workers enough to buy what they built. He developed manufacturing techniques that shaped industrial production for a century. His vision and drive made him one of the richest humans in history. 100 years later, his descendants control a company worth less than Tesla, a firm that didn't exist when some of Henry Ford's grandchildren were still alive. They maintain power through an outdated stock structure that lets them outvote shareholders who actually own the company. They're wealthy by ordinary standards, but have lost 95% of the relative wealth their ancestor commanded. The Ford empire isn't gone. The name still sells millions of vehicles annually. But it's fading, slowly losing relevance in a world that's moved beyond Henry Ford's vision. The family that once defined American manufacturing now struggles to keep pace with Chinese EV makers and Silicon Valley tech companies. That's the inevitable arc of dynastic wealth in America. Build something great. Watch your children struggle to maintain it. See it slip away from your grandchildren. By the great-grandchildren's generation, it's mostly gone, scattered among too many heirs, diminished by competition, overtaken by younger, hungrier companies. The Ford family had farther to fall than most, but fall they did, and continue to fall still, their empire fading as surely as Henry Ford's Model T faded from American roads a century ago. If you enjoyed this video, Please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.